The Bible mentions around 125 different kinds of animals throughout its chapters. Unfortunately for cat lovers, the dog is referenced 42 times, but not once does the Bible record or mention the house cat. But then again, Jesus is called the Lion of Judah. We are racing through the Bible, and this is an introduction to the New Testament letters and the book of Romans. Are you ready? Let's go. The last 22 books of the Bible are not really books, but letters, also known as epistles. The letter was a very common form of communication in the first century Mediterranean world. A very popular form of education was to have children write fictitious letters in the style of famous orators or intellectuals. The most common material used for letters was papyrus, which is where we get our word paper. It was made from the papyrus reed found all over Egypt, particularly on the banks of the Nile. Egypt exported paper all over the ancient Near East and beyond. The papyrus plant had a long stalk with flowers on the end. The stalk was cut into foot-long sections. These sections were then sliced lengthwise in thin strips and laid out edge to edge. Horizontal strips were then laid over it, and the two sections were pressed, dried, scraped, and rubbed. The finished product was a yellow, heavy, thick piece of paper. For long books, rolls or scrolls, which were several pieces of papyrus glued together, were used. A roll like this was called a biblios or biblion, which would eventually evolve into our word Bible. The writer wrote in columns, evenly spaced along the length of the roll, and then the reader read one column at a time, unrolling with one hand and rolling back with the other. Luke's gospel was estimated to be 30 feet long. The chapter and verse divisions are helpful to us, but the original readers didn't have those. So sometimes it's best to read letters through from beginning to end, just like you would with a letter or email from a friend. Papyrus was very brittle, especially when damp, and that is probably why we have no originals of these letters. There are 5 known New Testament letter writers and 1 unknown, the unnamed author of the letter to the Hebrews. The letter writers are the Apostle Paul, who wrote 13 New Testament letters, which is over half, the Apostle John, who wrote 3 short letters and the very meaty letter of Revelation, and the Apostle Peter, who wrote 2 letters, James, a half-brother of Jesus, his only letter was possibly the earliest New Testament letter, and Jude, another half-brother to Jesus, who wrote a short 1-chapter postcard. These letters addressed specific people living in specific cities and referenced specific situations and problems. At some point, however, early Christians recognized that God was using these letters to speak to larger and more universal issues. In fact, there are several letters that we don't have, including another Corinthian letter that Paul wrote, the letter that they wrote back, and a letter that Paul wrote to the Laodiceans, as well as letters that falsely bore Paul's name. The Gospels tell us that Jesus died and rose again, while these letters tell us why those events are significant and how we are to live in light of them. These letters instruct us, comfort us, challenge us, and at times expose us. They push us along the road to Christian maturity. The New Testament letters follow a style customary to the letters of the first century. Every child would have learned the form in school. At the beginning is the sender's name, followed by the greetings to those being written to. And first century letters always included a blessing or thanksgiving wish at the start of the letter. In the body of the letter, the writer would include the actual intention of the letter along with his instructions. In closing, the letter writer would include a personal bit of news and third-party greetings, and then would end with another blessing. In Romans, Paul is writing a very formal letter. Romans is the most carefully organized of all of Paul's letters. In it, he systematically explains what it means to be a Christian, and he represents himself almost as an ambassador. He is writing to Christians he had never met, who live in a place he had never been. He planned to go there, and eventually he would end up there, but when Paul writes Romans, his visit is still merely a dream. The Christian church in Rome wasn't started by Paul, but was rather probably started by Jews who were visiting Jerusalem on the day of Pentecost. Paul had met some of the leaders of the Roman church, and some of the Christians from churches that Paul had established traveled to Rome, and Paul had links to the Roman church. But he had never been, and he had never had the opportunity to teach them the foundational truths of the Christian faith. That's what this letter is. Paul wrote this letter in order to anchor the Roman Christians' faith on bedrock truth. The theme is found in Romans chapter 1, verse 16. That is why I am so eager to preach the gospel also to you who are in Rome. For I am not ashamed of the gospel, because it is the power of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes, first to the Jew and then to the Gentile. For in the gospel the righteousness of God is revealed, a righteousness that is by faith from first to last, just as it is written, the righteous will live by faith. What makes the book of Romans so powerful is that it is the foundational document of the Christian faith. Some people even say that if every other book of the New Testament were lost, every essential truth of the Christian faith could be drawn from the book of Romans. Paul is writing to the churches in Rome. They were probably ethnically diverse with both Jews and Gentiles, and they were having some tensions. The writer was the Apostle Paul. It was dictated to a secretary named Tertius and carried to Rome by a Christian woman named Phoebe. The letter was probably written from Corinth during Paul's third missionary journey, sometime around 57 AD. Romans is not the first letter that Paul wrote, but it is placed first in the collection because it is the longest and most foundational. Paul centered his explanation of the Christian faith on four themes. First, the bad news. God the judge sits behind the bench of justice. Three groups await the verdict, and the verdict is not good. He addresses the idol worshipers. The modern day equivalents, well, they would probably be isolated or uncontacted people and groups. Indigenous peoples, living without sustained contact with the outside world. They've never heard about Jesus. So what would Paul say to them? For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, His eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. Then Paul addresses the morally upright people. This would be people like Grandma Sue, who didn't go to church, but she was a really good person. About those people, Paul says, "For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God." And then Paul addresses the religious people like him and many of us. He writes, "What shall we conclude then? Do we have any advantage? Not at all. All are under the power of sin." If Romans ended at chapter 3, verse 20, then we'd all be in a heap of trouble. But beginning at the end of chapter 3 and going through chapter 8, Paul explains God's solution to the sin problem. God the judge gets up from his judgment seat, he takes off the robe, and he comes to earth to pay the penalty that we, the guilty, deserved. But God demonstrates his own love for us in this: while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. These chapters outline the benefits of believing in Jesus as our Savior, and the promises come fast and furious in this section. Paul imagines a Hebrew hand going up in the back of the room. Question: what about all the promises that you made to Israel? And the answer, well, in Romans chapter 9 through 11, Paul explains that when God's program for the church is complete, God will again focus on the people of Israel. In the final chapters of Romans, Paul explains how we should live in light of God's mercy.